At Thanksgiving dinner, my mom pointed at me and said the laziest one in the family in front of everyone. So I calmly revealed I'd been secretly paying my sister's rent every month and cut off the money for good. My name is Kayla Benton, and I was 28 years old when I realized that silence does not protect you. It only teaches people how far they can go without consequences. My mom looked straight at me, her face calm, her voice confident, and she said, "You are the laziest one at this table. Just look at your sister and learn something." Right after those words, my sister smirked, slowly lifting her glass with a quiet sense of victory that did not need any explanation, because she was enjoying the moment more than anyone else in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not shake. I placed my hands flat on the table, looked up, and said clearly, "Then this lazy one will stop paying $4,500 of her rent every month." My sister choked on her drink the second the words left my mouth, coughing so hard that the sound drew every eye in the room toward her without me having to say another word. The table went quiet in a way that felt heavy, not awkward, not dramatic, but real, as if everyone realized at the same time that something important had just been exposed. Before I take you inside my story, tell me this. Honestly, if you were in my place, would you stay silent or finally speak up? Comment your answer and tell me why. It started in a quiet house in Boise long before money was ever part of the problem. When I was younger, I learned very early how to move quietly through a room without asking for attention, because speaking up never felt safe and showing effort never seemed necessary in a house where noise mattered more than results. I would finish chores before anyone noticed, complete school projects without reminders, clean shared spaces after everyone left, and fix small mistakes that could have caused trouble later, while pretending none of it required energy or sacrifice. My sister, Brielle Benton, learned something very different about the same house. She learned how to stay visible, how to sound busy, and how to make every small action feel like a performance that deserved applause from anyone who was watching closely enough. Whenever something went smoothly, she would step forward, naturally describe what had been done, explain how stressful it had been, and accept praise without hesitation or discomfort. Mom saw what looked like movement, not what created stability. She listened to the stories that sounded impressive, instead of noticing the silence that kept everything working. When Brielle spoke about how tired she felt, Mom believed it without question, because effort was measured by tone of voice rather than by results that stayed invisible. I stayed quiet because correcting that story felt dangerous, even when the truth sat heavy in my chest. Dad worked in a way that taught him to trust what he could see clearly. If someone appeared busy, they earned respect without further inspection. If someone stayed silent, they were assumed to be idle or uninterested. He never asked who carried what responsibility in small moments that did not look dramatic from a distance. He looked at surfaces instead of foundations, so my work never reached him in a recognizable form. The word lazy started appearing in small ways that did not sound cruel at first, but settled deeply into how I was seen. It would show up in comments that sounded casual, in jokes that everyone else laughed at, in expectations that never suggested I could handle more than the bare minimum. I was not called lazy for failing. I was called lazy because I did not advertise what I carried quietly. Over time, I understood something that changed how I looked at every room in that house. Effort and recognition were not the same thing. The person who spoke the loudest controlled the story. The person who kept things from falling apart stayed invisible. Work without witnesses did not earn respect, even when it was the reason peace existed at all. That realization did not make me bitter in childhood. It made me careful. I stopped expecting fairness from people who never looked for it. I stopped waiting for credit that was never meant for me. I learned to protect my energy by giving less of myself to people who measured value through noise rather than through quiet effort. By the time I was grown, the label had already attached itself to my name inside that house. It followed me silently through every room. It lived in the space between what I did and what they believed. It never collapsed, never cracked, and never loosened, no matter how many responsibilities I handled without being asked. I knew long before adulthood that effort and reputation did not grow together in that family. By the time we were both adults, nothing had really changed. I built a life that looked quiet on the surface and stable underneath because that was the only way I knew how to survive in a world that never clapped for people like me. I chose work that rewarded consistency rather than attention learned to stay late without announcing it, and slowly created a reputation as someone who could be trusted when things went wrong. My job required focused patience and problem solving that never showed up on highlight reels. Yet it paid the bills, covered insurance, built savings, and gave me a sense of control that I had never felt as a child. Brielle moved in the opposite direction without ever saying it out loud. She stepped into work that depended on image timing and how people felt about her in any given moment. She leaned into roles that put her in front of cameras at events and rooms where people noticed energy more than outcomes. She shifted from one opportunity to another, chasing visibility, collecting connections, and building the kind of social story that sounded impressive when repeated out loud. When she talked about her day, it always sounded urgent and full of momentum, even when little had actually been secured. Mom listened to those stories the way people listen to headlines. She heard motion and interpreted it as effort. She heard excitement and translated it into bravery. When Brielle spoke about meetings, contacts, or future possibilities, Mom nodded as if proof had already arrived. When I spoke about deadlines, projects, or long hours behind a screen, the response was polite but distant because my work had no dramatic language attached to it. My results lived in quiet places, so they never felt real to her. Dad never meant to be unfair, but he trusted what he could see with his own eyes. He understood physical exhaustion, visible deadlines, raised voices, movement that filled a room. When he looked at my work, he only saw a chair, a desk, a computer screen, and a calm face. He interpreted that calm as ease instead of discipline. He called it light work, without realizing that my mind never turned off even when my hands were still. To him, effort only existed if it looked uncomfortable from the outside. At family dinners, the pattern became so familiar that I stopped expecting anything different. If someone asked what I did, I answered, honestly, explained the structure of my work, tried to describe the pressure without complaining. The conversation never stayed there for long. It always slid back toward Brielle, toward her schedule, toward her contacts, toward how impressive it sounded when she described the room she walked into. I started to feel like a background character in my own story. Not because I felt small, but because their attention never learned to rest anywhere else. What changed slowly inside me was not anger, but clarity. I began to understand that truth mattered less than narrative in that house. Facts did not win, volume did. Consistency did not impress, performance did. I stopped trying to explain myself in ways they could not hear. I stopped offering details that went nowhere. I learned to keep parts of my life private because sharing them only taught people how to minimize them. There was no dramatic argument that marked this realization. It happened quietly while I balanced accounts late at night, reviewed reports that no one at home would ever understand, and planned futures that no one asked about. I saw that my stability scared people who lived on excitement because stability could not be performed. I saw that my silence was mistaken for weakness because weakness was easier for them to understand than restraint. By then, I no longer wanted their approval as much as I wanted peace. I wanted control over my choices. I wanted a life that did not rely on applause to feel real. I kept building without announcing. I kept growing without performing. I let them keep their story because I had started writing my own in places they never looked at closely. That was the season of my life where I finally accepted something hard without resentment. The truth of my effort, it never mattered as much as the story someone else told. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to compete with a voice that was always louder than mine. Not long after that, I sent the first payment without thinking too much. The first call came late one evening when the day had already drained most of my energy, leaving me in that quiet state where saying yes feels easier than asking questions. Brielle's voice sounded sharp around the edges, tight in a way that felt real enough to scare me. She said she had miscalculated of her commissions, said the landlord was no longer patient, said the notice on her door felt humiliating. I listened longer than I should have because fear carries a tone that is difficult to ignore when it belongs to someone you grew up with. At that moment, helping felt logical, not emotional. I opened my banking app while she was still talking, moved the money before she finished explaining the details, then told her not to worry because it was temporary, because it was just a small bridge to get her through one stressful moment. I believed that sentence as I said it. I believed it because I had been trained to solve problems quietly instead of studying why they existed. The next month did not feel like a pattern at first. It felt like bad timing, unlucky breaks, slow paperwork, late transfers. Brielle became softer with me. Her tone changed from urgency to familiarity. She began to speak as if leaning on me was not a request, but a shared understanding between two sisters. I did not argue because I wanted to believe that trust was stronger than discomfort. I told myself that real family support was not supposed to feel calculated. Slowly, my habits changed without ceremony. I stopped browsing flights when friends talked about weekend trips. I chose cheaper groceries without thinking about it. I delayed replacing shoes even when the soles wore thin. I canceled plans that required explanation because explaining felt heavier than adjusting my own life. None of this felt dramatic in the moment. It felt like responsibility. It felt like adulthood. Brielle adjusted in a different direction. Her tone grew lighter. Her stress sounded rehearsed instead of raw. She stopped thanking me. She started telling me what month would be better, what opportunity was close, what connection was about to pay off. The conversations lasted longer, but said less. I began to notice that the story always had a happy ending just ahead of reach, always one step beyond the present, always needing one more month of patience. The worst part was not the money itself. It was the way my mind slowly reorganized around the obligation. I started planning my budget with her rent already removed, as if it were a fixed bill I had always owed. I checked my own balance with a quiet fear that felt shameful, because it existed silently. I stopped talking about my goals because they felt irrelevant when measured against someone else's emergency. I did not feel generous. I felt trapped inside a version of myself that kept agreeing because stopping felt selfish. Mom never questioned where Brielle's stability came from. She praised effort because she could hear it. She admired movement because it looked like ambition to her. She never asked how the rent was covered, never asked why the apartment remained untouched by consequence, never noticed that my lifestyle grew smaller each month. Dad saw nothing unusual because nothing loud was happening around me. My sacrifice had no sound, so it had no shape in their eyes. The imbalance began to settle into my thoughts in quiet ways that did not feel like anger yet. I noticed it when I hesitated before grocery shopping. I noticed it when I avoided friends. I noticed it when my reflection looked more tired while her social world stayed bright. I still loved her. I still wanted her safe. I also started to sense that something unfair was building inside me, slow enough to avoid attention, but real enough to change the way I breathed. I told myself it would end once she found her footing. I told myself real help was never counted. I told myself that being strong meant being silent. Those thoughts kept me going longer than logic ever could, even when the pattern no longer felt like help and started to feel like ownership. The week before Thanksgiving felt different even before anyone said anything. Work shifted in ways I did not expect, not through noise or celebration, but through quiet recognition that settled over me like a calm weight. My supervisor called me into a small conference room where sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin golden lines, telling me that my projects had stabilized several operational gaps that others had failed to notice. Explaining that my consistency had become the framework others now relied on. I thanked him with the same soft voice I used for everything serious, though something inside me softened in a way I had not felt before because for once, effort existed without the need for defense. As that steadiness grew, the tension on Brielle's side grew louder in a way I could feel through my phone without even unlocking it. The messages arrived wrapped in casual language, built to sound like small inconveniences rather than emergencies. Yet each one carried a familiar weight that pressed gently against my sense of responsibility. She spoke about delays again, about timing that worked against her, about how certain expectations could not be postponed. I listened without arguing, though I felt the difference in my body, the way my shoulders no longer accepted the pressure as naturally as they had before. Mom shifted into preparation mode, filling the house with a particular kind of excitement that centered around presentation rather than connection. She spoke about outfits that would look good in photos, asked questions about schedules that might appear impressive to guests, spent more time describing how vibrant Brielle's life had become than asking what had been happening in mine. Her voice brightened when she used Brielle's name, as if the holidays belonged more to energy than to stability. It was in the middle of this week that my best friend Tessa Morgan sat across from me in a quiet corner of a coffee shop that smelled like burnt sugar and warm foam, watching my hands wrap once too tightly around the paper cup. She did not lecture me. She did not criticize anyone. She said something simple in a tone that stayed calm, explaining that support should not erase the person giving it. She said it gently enough that I did not feel judged, yet clearly enough that I felt seen. I did not reply right away because for the first time, I could see the shape of my choices without trying to excuse them. Recognition at work continued in small, steady ways. Emails carried my name. Meetings paused for my input. My ideas moved forward without resistance. None of it looked dramatic yet. It built a quiet structure around my confidence that I had not allowed myself to feel before. Brielle's pressure felt different to me now. Each request sounded the same as always, yet I heard it with clearer ears. The pattern no longer felt invisible. It felt mapped. It felt familiar in a way that made my chest tighten rather than soften. I noticed the way the timing always leaned toward urgency. I noticed the way the language avoided real responsibility. I noticed how often I adjusted myself without being asked directly. Mom continued talking about the table settings, the guest list, the story she wanted the family to appear as from the outside. I nodded through those conversations, while something new grew quietly in me, a thin but solid line that separated what was mine to carry from what was not. I did not confront anyone that week. I did not announce changes. I simply started drawing invisible borders inside my thoughts, deciding where my care would end, even if my love did not. By the time Thanksgiving approached, I no longer felt like a background presence in my own life, even though I had not spoken that truth out loud. When I sat down at that table, I already felt done inside. The chair felt heavier than it should have when I pulled it closer, not because of its weight, but because of the quiet pressure that had been building inside me for years without relief. I folded my hands gently, kept my eyes level with the table, and watched how easily everyone else settled into comfort that had never been meant for me. Mom lifted her glass slowly, her smile polished in a way that felt more like performance than warmth, while her eyes moved across the table with confidence, as if she already knew how the moment was supposed to look. She finally said, "I just feel proud because in this family, some people understand what real effort looks like, and some people know how to work instead of just existing quietly in the background." She paused long enough for the silence to stretch before turning her gaze toward Brielle. She added, "That's what hard work looks like. Just look at your sister." Brielle leaned back slightly in her chair, relaxed her shoulders in a way that felt practiced, and allowed a slow, deliberate smirk to appear at the corner of her mouth. She lifted her glass with a careful flick of her wrist, took a small sip, and glanced toward me briefly before looking away, as if she had already decided how small I was meant to feel. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the pressure that used to silence me before my thoughts could fully exist, but this time, I allowed the feeling to stay without letting it bend my spine or shake my hands. I reached for my water, took a measured sip without urgency, and set the glass down with control before lifting my eyes. I said, "Then this lazy one will stop paying $4,500 of her rent every single month." My voice stayed calm. My breathing remained even. My hands did not break their stillness. The air shifted in a slow, almost visible way, not through noise but through tension, as if the room itself needed a moment to decide how to react. Brielle's body jerked forward as she choked on her drink, coughing sharply while liquid spilled from her glass onto her shaking hand, her shoulders tightening as she struggled to catch her breath without drawing further attention. Dad leaned toward her immediately, driven by habit rather than awareness, lowering his voice to a whisper that carried more weight than it should have. He whispered Brielle. That single name sounded heavier than a sentence, not because of volume, but because of everything it represented in that moment. The atmosphere grew thicker around the table, not loud, not chaotic, but heavy in a way that made every movement feel delayed as forks hovered above plates. Glasses paused in midair, and even breathing felt more deliberate. Mom tried to preserve her composure, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed her effort, and she said, "Let's not make this uncomfortable for everyone." I lifted my chin slightly, kept my tone gentle, and answered without raising my voice. "I'm not making it uncomfortable. I'm just done pretending it was ever fair." No one reached for laughter. No one tried to soften the silence. No one found a joke to hide behind. The truth remained in the air, settled between plates, glasses, and hands that no longer moved naturally, while Brielle avoided my eyes, completely focusing instead on wiping her fingers with a napkin that tore slightly from the pressure of her grip. Dad cleared his throat softly, but chose not to speak, his fingers staying close to his glass without lifting it, while Mom adjusted a plate that had no reason to be moved, her hands too careful, too controlled, too slow. Inside me, something shifted. Not with anger, not with noise, but with a quiet sense of finality that felt stronger than fear, as the weight I had carried began to loosen without needing permission. For the first time, the silence did not make me feel small. A few hours after dinner, the house was louder than it had ever been. The living room felt tight, as if the walls had moved closer without anyone noticing, pressing the air until every breath felt like a decision that had to be made. No one sat comfortably. No one pretended anymore. Every sound came from the same place, a raw place where words stopped being polite and started becoming weapons that had been waiting for years. Mom stood near the end of the couch and spoke first, her voice cutting through the space with a sharpness she no longer tried to hide as she said, "You embarrassed your own sister in front of everyone, and you call that respect." Dad stayed standing, arms crossed, his voice lower but heavier when he answered, "We cannot keep calling the truth disrespect just because it hurts." His words did not calm the room. They deepened the crack that had already formed. Betrayal did not wait. She stepped forward quickly, her jaw tight, her eyes locked on mine, and she said, "You think you are strong now because they heard you, but you only proved how selfish you really are." Her words did not tremble. They burned. She wanted them to land. I walked fully into the center of the room, not slowly, and not to make a point, but because I refused to stay on the edge of something that had already consumed so much of my life. When I spoke, my voice stayed low but clear because it did not need to compete with shouting anymore. I am not helping again. Not with money, not with errands, not with silence, not with pretending. I'm done completely. Mom turned toward me with a look that was more shock than anger, and she said, "You are acting like you have no responsibility to this family." I answered her without raising my voice or softening it. I took responsibility when no one asked. I paid for things no one saw, and I stayed quiet when it cost me everything, and that is why this ends now. Dad stepped forward a little, his expression careful, like he was trying to choose words that could still fix something, and he asked, "You are really willing to let this fall apart?" I met his eyes and replied, "It was already falling apart while I was the only one holding it together." Brielle's reaction shifted, her hands clenched, her shoulders tightened. Her voice lifted when she spoke again, not pleading this time, but threatening. "If you walk away from this, I will make sure people know what you are really like." She wanted fear. She wanted hesitation. She wanted me to bend. I did not step back. I did not lower my head. I did not try to defend myself. "You can say whatever story you need to survive this, but I am not bending anymore to make you comfortable." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than the shouting had felt. No one moved. No one interrupted. Even Mom stopped speaking. Even Dad stopped adjusting his stance. Brielle stayed frozen where she stood. I stayed where I was breathing evenly, feeling something solid inside me that did not exist before, something that did not depend on approval or permission. After that, I walked away from the center of the room and toward the hallway, not because I was escaping, not because I felt weak, but because I had said everything I needed to say without losing myself in the noise. When I closed the guest room door behind me, the house was still loud. For the first time, I was not. Months later, everything became quiet in a way I had never known. The quiet did not feel empty or lonely. It felt organized, predictable, and strangely gentle, as if my life had finally stopped living in emergency mode. I woke up without dread, worked without constant tension, and slept without replaying old conversations in my head. The silence was not a lack of sound, but the absence of chaos. Brielle did not adjust smoothly to the new reality. Without my support, she was forced to leave the apartment she had treated as a permanent reward. Rather than a temporary privilege, she moved into a smaller place that required her to budget, to plan, and to accept that responsibility could no longer be avoided by shifting it onto others. The lifestyle she had built on comfort had to shrink, and for the first time, she experienced consequences that could not be smoothed over by someone else's effort. Mom could not control the outcome the way she always believed she could. She tried to manage conversations, tried to redirect blame, and tried to convince herself that things would simply return to the way they had been. The reality refused to obey her expectations, and the illusion of control slowly cracked as she realized that no amount of pressure or guilt could force me back into the role I had already released. Dad kept contact, but from a distance. He sent brief messages, asked simple questions, and avoided emotional conversations that might force him to choose between comfort and honesty. His presence became a line rather than a bridge, a reminder that connection can exist without closeness when fear is still stronger than understanding. I did not step back into the role of rescue. I did not offer silent payments, quiet fixes, or hidden sacrifices. My life stayed calm because I protected it. I built routines that belonged to me and learned how to feel safe without being needed. I stopped measuring my worth through how much I could ease the lives of people who never asked how heavy the burden had become. There was no reunion, no dramatic apology, and no sudden healing moment. There was only distance that felt clean rather than painful. I learned that distance does not always mean hatred. Sometimes it means respect for the space required to stay whole. Setting boundaries inside a family is not an act of cruelty, and it is not a rejection of love. It is a form of self-respect that allows a person to exist without constant emotional exhaustion or financial pressure. When you stop allowing people to define your value through what you provide, you begin to understand that peace is not earned through sacrifice, but protected through clarity, courage, and consistency.